Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I'm on the road this week again. I'm recording from Minneapolis. Rob has been all over the place with meetings, but we still got together to do a short podcast here Friday morning. It's not our usual hour-long diatribe, but maybe you guys will like the shorter podcast. So we breeze through some of the top things. And I would say the theme of this podcast is sort of admitting about the things we don't know, the things that we need to think about a little bit more. And I think that's one of the things that makes us different. In some ways, I think the reason people like the podcast is you're learning alongside me. Like the podcast started as me trying to figure out answers to questions or figuring out the right questions to ask. And this was definitely more of a questions asking episode. So if you want to talk about CI or anything like that, you know where to email me. It's jacob@cognitive.investments. A lot of you have left new reviews for the podcast. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Cheers. See you out there. Morning from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Rob, you probably know this about me. I don't know if the listeners do. I was once a singer in the Cornell University Glee Club, a bass singer, no doubt. And as you can probably hear in my voice, I was talking all day yesterday. Anyway, my voice is particularly low. And I wish I was in the Glee Club right now, because right now I bet I could hit the low B minor and the Rachmaninoff Vespers. How's that for a nerdy intro? How are you doing?
I don't even know where to go with that one, but
I didn't think
your
you
voice
would.
Sounds great to me.
I'm trying to stump you. I also, if we were not a professional podcast, I would title this podcast "The Return of the Finger Condom," because I had to have a mole shaved off my finger, and I am wearing finger condoms in the shower again. So shout out to Kate. I know that you will appreciate that story. But enough nonsense. Let's dive right in. We only have 40 minutes today, listeners, because we're kind of bouncing all over the place, but you might like that. But Rob, it might also mean we need to keep our references to the English Civil War to a minimum, because I'm not sure we can get through everything that we need to if we do that. But I thought we would start.
My pontificating on the Assyrian Empire is not going to fit into today's program? That's too bad.
Oh, I mean, I love it, but we have to balance between the content that the listeners are here for and the stuff that you and I just like talking about. But for me, in some ways, it was sort of a quiet week relative to the last couple of weeks. But I thought that the most interesting thing that happened was NuScale Power, which is this company. It's the only publicly traded company that I know of that is trying to build small modular reactors in the United States. They had a contract or an agreement with the Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems that they were going to build a small modular reactor there, and it was approved. But they announced this week that they didn't have enough utility partners at the checkpoint to move forward. And so they're shutting down the project. And so the only small modular reactor project that was on the books for the United States is now canceled. And I mean, we have talked about this for some time, and it intersects with a lot of different things. We've talked about how China and India is where all new nuclear capacity and really innovation is coming online in the world. We've talked about US bureaucratic red tape and how it doesn't seem to allow the United States to build nice things, even if the United States has expertise and things like that. I asked Miles about this, and maybe we'll have him on and talk about it a little more, but NuScale even had to recently change their design because of the costs, and his takeaway was that as long as the NRC exists in its current form, nuclear is going to be difficult in the United States than most other places. So I saw that, and then I thought I'll leave it over to you to share what you shared on the research channel earlier this morning, because it sort of dovetailed in a nice and interesting way.
Yeah, so in an unrelated story, what I had shared on the research channel was that here in Paris, there was a big piece about a nearly kilometer-long tunnel and a tank, essentially. A tank that's the size of, I think, 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools that they're building right here in central Paris, right between Gare d'Austerlitz and a 17th century church, as they said. And they're almost done. They cranked it out. They're getting it done in time for the Olympics, and they're going to use this to withdraw the wastewater from the Seine and make the Seine clean enough that they're going to actually have swimming events in the river during the Olympics. So it was an interesting contrast between how quickly and easily and frictionlessly things seem to be getting done in other places relative to the U.S., but with real ramifications.
there's all sorts of tunnel-related humor, gallows humor related to Hamas that I could probably make, and I'm going to abstain just because I don't want to get in trouble. But listeners, just so you know, my head went there for a second. That's the kind of brain that I have. Yeah, and I mean the France example is a little. I guess it's different building a tank versus building a small modular reactor. But I don't know. Like everywhere I go now, and when I'm giving talks, and the more I talk about the U.S. energy situation, the more convoluted it seems to me, because the U.S. has plenty of natural gas and hydrocarbons, but it is pushing renewables and EVs, which we've talked about ad nauseum. And when it wants to build nuclear, which the United States should be at the front of the pack for, we can't get anything done. So I don't know. It's a pretty frustrating thing if you're thinking about sort of constraints that are holding the U.S. Economy back. It's not just the political infighting in Washington, which is one thing, and we'll get to that in a second too.
Why do you think, not to get too philosophical here, but I mean, we talk about these bottlenecks and red tape issues all the time. I mean, this has been a constant theme on the podcast. Why do you think they persist? Do you think it's the lack of will to streamline these processes? Do you think it's lack of political cohesion to put, new processes in place to get this done, to overcome sort of the infighting or the NIMBYism and various other factors that tend to bog things down? Or why is, we kind of gave the humorous comparison between France and the US, and obviously those are two different projects, but imagine trying to do what Paris just did in New York City, for example. It would be $15 billion, and it would be, we'd be here in 2045 still talking about it. Why do you think there's such a stark difference? It's not like France doesn't have a huge bureaucracy.
Well, I think the answer there is for that specific project with the Seine. I mean, France has the Olympics coming, so there's a time limit, and the French government has made something a priority, so it has to sort of push forward. Whereas, and we've said this before, it's one of the ironic things about the United States. The economy is doing good. Everybody's been saying that we were going to head towards a recession and that things would eventually get bad, but the economy is running too good. I read your macro book this morning that our research subscribers get, and the U.S. economy still looks like it's humming along. And I don't think you get the types of major changes that you need in things like, bureaucratic red tape and logistics infrastructure until you get real problems. It takes a lot to shake people out of their inertia. So, I mean, that's my best guess, but I'm only just sort of guessing there right now. I guess the way to even, the starker way to compare this particular issue with maybe, how other countries are doing this. China approved, I'm looking at this article right now from World Nuclear News, 10 new nuclear reactors last year alone, and they're already starting to talk about, what all the many reactors they're going to build in the future. So we've also talked about the difference between authoritarian governments and how they can push stuff through, and maybe they don't have innovation, but when it comes to, just basic building of stuff, they're better at it, at least in the short term. So that's my best answer, but, I'm grasping at straws. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, it's worth thinking about, I suppose, but we can move on since we're time constrained today. I was going to say something about the English Civil War, but I'm going to pass
because
on that.
Nuclear power was such an important part of the Cromwellian Revolution.
Well, what I was going to say, I'm going to say my English Civil War thing, because I really did have something to say about the English Civil War. So I was thinking about this while I was walking to work today, and one of the things that's really striking, because I was thinking about this in relation to the upcoming U.S. elections as well, and just thinking about Trump and sort of the thesis about that a lot of the developments that we've seen in recent years are related to a breakdown in traditional authority figures, right? And that Trump was the ultimate anti-authority kind of outsider, kind of thumbing his nose at traditional authority figures and such. And what I'm getting at here is it's really striking to me, and I wonder if there's comparisons between countries that have had things good and then tend to fall into sort of ideological warfare and infighting and arguments, in large part fueled by new communication technologies. So again, English Civil War, like the printing press was invented in the late 1400s, but it really wasn't until that time in the mid 1600s that it became something that was sufficiently broad that lots of people were communicating and sending out pamphlets with, fake news about Irish Catholics eating babies and stuff like that.
The Twitter of its time.
It was the Twitter of its time, right? So you see certain societies like that sort of splintering and turning inward and having these arguments and essentially civil wars, which in many ways you could say, there's echoes of that in the US. Not that we have a civil war, but certainly there's a big argument culturally about what kind of nation we want to be, in a way that probably didn't exist, 30 years ago. And then, if you take that and compare it to something like France at the same time, right? France was not destabilizing, it was stabilizing after a period of real disruption and volatility. And they had, essentially civil war for 150 years in France before, during this time, they were finally saying, okay, we're done with that. We want more moderation. We're going to centralize. We're going to sort of rally around one narrative of the nation and in a way that, and France, of course, spent the 1600s rising and reaching an apogee, and England was a mess. I guess what I'm getting at is, do you think that you could use that comparison in any way to think about different nations and their trend of direction here? So we've talked about Europe coming together. They obviously have sort of a shared memory that's much more traumatic and seeking calmness more than maybe the U.S. is. Whereas the U.S., you could compare to England in that scenario. Lots of volatility, lots of fighting about where we're going to go, who we're going to be, because we haven't had that sort of experience to make people crave stability, crave getting things done over ideological battles. That was a long-winded thing, but
yeah, I mean, I guess I would say two things there. The first is, I don't think Americans actually disagree about as much as they think they do, and I say that, when you look at polls for the things that Americans agree on, like things like immigration law reform, like I bet, I was talking about this with a friend last night over a drink after my talk. I bet that if you went and surveyed every single American and said, you know what, we're going to build a wall and we're going to quadruple legal immigration to the United States, and we are going to welcome the people that we want to come to the United States are people with skills that are important for the U.S. economy, that are in short supply in the labor economy. I bet you 90% of Americans would go for that, and yet Congress can't do that. And that's in some ways how Congress is designed. Like, Congress is designed to gum up the wheels if there is disagreement, because you don't want the government to be able to do things if there isn't agreement within society. But I think the place that the United States is breaking down right now is that the factions that, Madison and Hamilton were so afraid about in the Federalist Papers have sort of taken control. And so the system is actually gumming up even the stuff that people actually agree on. So there's that sort of boring structural Federalist Papers, I'm a nerd sort of comment there. The second thing, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast once or twice before, but I'll bring it up again, which is, that study that was in Nature a couple months ago that had data from, I think it was 70 different countries over the last 60 years, I think was what it was. And it showed that for over that entire time period in all of those countries, people thought that the world was bad now and that things were getting worse. And yet, as they remembered the past, they sort of forgot all about the bad things. And so I think there is this, and this goes back to your, Twitter of the time and how social media is affecting us right now. I think humans have always latched on to negative information. It's like the junk food for our brains, but there is something about the way that it is so immediately available all the time on social media that it seems to be affecting the psychology. And I think that's American, that's European. I think I've been disappointed about the level of European cohesion over basic issues like Ukraine, over the rule of law and whether that's important, whether Hungary should be allowed to still get its EU funds when it continues to stick out like a sore thumb in terms of EU foreign. Like, we don't see any of that cohesion really rising in the European Union. So I don't know, maybe we will, we got used to the printing press and having books around. Maybe we'll get used to Twitter and we'll sort of reach a new normal. But I often get asked when I give presentations, what do you think the role of social media is? And I often dismiss the question because I'm like, well, we've always had, as you pointed out, disruptive sources of information flow, but maybe the rapidity of the negative flow that social media allows is changing things. I don't know.
Well, I don't know either.
Well, yeah. All right. We don't know. We talked that one out really good. The listeners are smarter for that. The second thing I wanted to talk about today with you, Rob, is Brazil. Brazil passed tax reform. I know that the listeners think that this is scintillating, but it's actually a really, really big deal. And it's a really important juxtaposition with what we just talked about in the United States and Europe, because this has been, for decades, has been a problem in Brazil. The Brazilian Senate approved it, but had some tweaks to it. So now it has to go back to the lower house, and then Lula can sign it, where it'll probably happen. To summarize just some of the basic points. So right now, Brazil's consumption tax system, it has a 5 multi-tiered layer. So there's like 5 different taxes with multiple tiers within those different taxes. And they're going to reduce it down to just 2 taxes. So one at the federal level and one for states and municipalities. It's also, and I was going to ask you about this, Rob, one of the big changes is that they're changing the tax system from an origin-based sales tax to a destination-based sales tax. So taxes are going to be collected where the buyer is, rather than where the product, where the buyer is located or where the product is headed, rather than where the business is headquartered. And I had some questions about that because that didn't seem to me to be a sort of, didn't fit with our thesis. And there are also, the Senate put in some breaks and things like that for specific items like basic food necessities and things like that. But the upshot is that Brazil is moving forward with tax reform, that a center-left President Lula is working with a center-right, can we even call it right-wing Brazilian Congress, and they are passing something that Brazilians have been wanting for decades and haven't been able to get through the system. So it's an opportunity for you to talk about your favorite. I think Brazil is your favorite country in the world, right? But I also wanted to ask you if you thought that thing about the origin versus the destination was in any way a challenge to the overall view.
I would say favorite is a loaded term, but definitely up there. So a few things. The first, on the passage of the tax reform itself, I think it's really supportive of the thesis that Brazil is moving in a more moderate direction than most people were giving it credit for. And we've talked about this, and again, in relation to what we just discussed, this craving for stability, a move toward a position of wanting to compromise, to negotiate, to find solutions to problems. Brazil is on the opposite side. They just had many, many years of instability. The current generation that's running the place has very vigorous memories of the 1990s and inflation and craziness all around. And this is a really good thing in general. On the origin versus where it's being consumed element. So this is interesting, and we haven't talked about this and I haven't looked at it, but one of the things that I've been watching in Brazil is, so they've been making some moves in relation to specifically imported small goods from China. So if you look at Shein and Temu, for example, the 2 big behemoths of Chinese e-commerce, essentially what they've done is they've created a business model in some ways around a tax loophole, which is if you import an item from China, as long as it's below a certain dollar value, and this is the case in the US and Brazil, as far as I understand. Certainly in the US it is, but if it's below that dollar value, then you do not have to pay tariffs, normal import duties. And the way that they've proceeded in the US is they've essentially come in, and the reason why they can sell things for, sell a bicycle for $2 or whatever, the kind of crazy stuff they have on there, is because they've structured this in a way where technically you have all these individual sellers going through and they literally do not package the items together. They have to individually package each thing, bring it over from China. And because of that, they don't have to incur these tariffs. So Brazil, I know when they were contemplating tax reform, this was one of the issues that they were discussing, because certain groups wanted to eliminate the tariffs and for very small items, and then the Brazilian government pushed back on that, specifically because they did not want to give an undue sort of source of competitive advantage to Temu and Shein and companies like that. And it's kind of interesting because Shein created a big manufacturing hub I think it's a distribution center and manufacturing, or maybe just distribution. I'm not entirely sure, but they're building a lot in Brazil. They're building, they're making a significant investment in the country. And it's kind of an interesting development, because that's not, you don't usually do that in Brazil if you're a Chinese-based e-commerce company. So anyway, that's a lot of moving parts, but I wonder if the origin versus, place of consumption tax issue could have some relation to those two companies in particular.
So that's interesting. And I mean, it's interesting too, because Brazil is really trying to thread the needle there. I mean, they want to have good relations with the United States, but especially under Lula, they want to be part of the BRICS and, a more multipolar world. And they definitely have been strengthening their relationship with China. And if they continue to strengthen their relationship with China, they will at some point probably, I don't want to say get in trouble with the United States. That sounds a little bit too, high and mighty. But we have seen that the United States has not taken kindly to Latin American countries sort of fostering better trade relations with China. And Brazil is definitely doing that, and us also sort of elbowing out some U.S. exporters from China, especially when it comes to agricultural commodities. So that might be something that Brazil needs to worry about in the future, I guess. It was something Bolsonaro was sort of rhetorically worried about, and then as soon as he got into office, he sort of realized, well, no, we actually need relations with China if we're going to have the economy going forward. And Lula, obviously, is very pragmatic when it comes to foreign policy. All right, so I think one more sort of explicitly geopolitical topic before we move kind of into U.S. markets and then go on our merry way, which is I'm starting to get worried about Ukraine, Rob. For the last 6 months, I've been more in the camp of I thought Ukraine was winning the war. I felt encouraged in that view by things that when Simtak, our military expert, came on the podcast a couple times, that made me feel good about that. When Jacek Bartoszak, our Polish analyst, I recorded a podcast with him earlier this week, it's coming out on Monday. I felt good about it from that perspective. But it's been a troubling couple of weeks for Ukraine, because it's clear that the counteroffensive has failed. It's clear that there's internal strife within Ukraine. So you've got, last week you had the commander of Ukraine's forces putting out this essay and giving an interview to The Economist describing the war as a stalemate. And you had the Zelensky government reacting very negatively to that. And it was very obviously not coordinated, and the Zelensky government felt sort of taken aback by the fact that this general would go out and say that. One of his aides this week died in an accident or a booby trap, or there was a grenade in the mail, or there are like a couple different stories circulating out there, which is the type of thing that's supposed to happen in Russia, like the aide of the general who criticizes the leader, like it's supposed to happen in Russia, not supposed to happen in Ukraine. In the meantime, the cracks that we saw in Putin's rule earlier this year with the Prigozhin incident, Putin seems to have reestablished himself. I get like Twitter messages every 2 weeks. People are sending me, oh, here's the latest thing. Putin's had a heart attack. He's dead. He's never dead. He turns up and he's always doing something or just doing whatever you're supposed to do as a Russian leader. The poll numbers in both the United States and Europe are declining for support for Ukraine going forward. The war in the Middle East has definitely taken U.S. focus off of the Ukraine war and now is sort of directed it more towards the Middle East, both in terms of attention, but also in terms of ammunition. You start to stack on, all of the information. The data doesn't look particularly good. So I don't know if I have a question in there for you, but I thought I would just say it's been building now for a couple of weeks, but I'm getting increasingly concerned that Ukraine is doing a lot worse than I thought. And the last thing I'll just say is I will step on the podcast with Jacek that we're releasing Monday. He was even more pessimistic than I was. I was taken aback at how sort of negative he was about the Ukrainian government and about the prospects for victory for Ukraine's armed forces. So I'll let you take that whatever direction you want, but I'm feeling a little sober about the direction of the war right now.
And yet I'm not sure that it's so different from what you had said at the outset, because from what I recall, what you said was Russia wins because they just outlast everyone. And they can outlast people in terms of manpower, in terms of willingness to just dig in terms of outlasting the media cycle. And the media cycle is way past Ukraine, as much as it's sad to say. I mean, we've already got another war dominating everyone's attention. So...
Yeah, although I'm glad you said that, because that's interesting to me too. I'm waiting for Israel-Gaza to drop out of the media cycle a little bit, and it is not. If anything, it's intensifying. And we had that podcast earlier this week with Hafsa Halawa, who was talking about what's happening in Sudan and Ethiopia. I've tried to continue to bang on what's happening in the South China Sea and the Philippines and China and how that's a big deal. I mean, I looked at the Wall Street Journal this morning, and I clicked on the world section. Basically, every article was Israel-Gaza. And I sort of understood that if we were headed towards a 1973 oil embargo sort of situation and a global oil price crisis, but that's not where we're headed. I mean, it's a very depressing conflict. I'm not trying to make light of it, but it feels like Ukraine has gotten pushed out of the headlines a lot easier than the Israel-Gaza war has gotten pushed out of the headlines.
I would imagine because in many ways it's so ideologically charged. And maybe people were surprised at how ideologically charged it would turn out to be. But I would imagine that that's helping to prolong the level of interest by the media to write about every aspect of it and sort of keep that in the headlines, because it's, the subject of such controversy and arguments and, public protests and campus protests and that sort of thing, more so than Ukraine ever would be. I mean,
I guess so, although I still see people flying Ukrainian flags in different parts of the United States. I mean, I remember when the Ukraine issue was like the thing that sort of united the median American voter. But yeah, I appreciate you saying that it's not that different from what I was saying before about Russia outlasting Ukraine. But I thought Ukraine could do it. I thought that Europe would pony up with ammunition and help them start producing it, and that Prigozhin's assault on Moscow was evidence that maybe Russia couldn't last that long, that there were bigger internal pressures that were sort of seeking to break Russia apart. The other thing that's been happening in the last couple of weeks, I mean, Ukraine is a corrupt country, more corrupt than most countries, and everybody sort of knows that. And the big issue for Ukrainian governance going forward, and we've talked about this on the podcast, how Zelensky sort of had to wage a war against Russia militarily, but then also on corruption within Ukraine itself. But I have been hearing from so many different sources, both, friends and contacts who are in Ukraine or around Ukraine, or also just the way the media is reporting about this right now, about how Zelensky's corrupt and how the system is even worse than it was before. And every dollar that you put into Ukraine, 50 cents of it is disappearing somewhere in a black hole. So you just have to sort of write off half the cost of investment. So I'm hearing that narrative too. And that's also really disturbing, because that is the thing that is going to make the European Union, and I should say the European Commission, came out this week and supported beginning accession negotiations for Ukraine, even though they haven't made enough progress on a couple key issues that they want them to make progress on. But the European Commission is behaving as we thought they would, talking about EU expansion and bringing Ukraine into the bloc. But I don't know, something just isn't right. Like the last couple of weeks, the news flow, the developments. Maybe I can't put my finger on it quite directly, and I hope I'm wrong, but something feels off. Something feels like it has changed within Ukraine internally.
It's a really tricky question, because I think there's the facts on the ground, and then there's the perception and trying to analyze what the media is saying about something. And I'm not an expert in this area, as you know, but one thing that I would point out is, at least with regard to Russia, for instance, ironically, last week we talked about ASML and how people are always going to overestimate them because the risks are the unknown unknowns. It's the thing that you can't, something is coming for them. You don't know what it is. Logically that the risks are elevated, but you don't see it in front of your face. So you naturally underestimate it. And I think in a different context, you could apply the same approach to Russia. Russia is a mess. We know that logically. We know, based on what happened earlier this year, based on what little information does get out, it's not great. It's not great at all. And I think when there's a vacuum of information and something hasn't happened, there's a natural tendency to be like, oh, it's never going to happen. Like Putin could be gone tomorrow. Like, I don't think the probability of that is necessarily less than it was 6 months ago.
No, it's just he could also be gone in 12 years. I mean, it took Tsar Nicholas, 12 years after the 1904-05 Japan War and the beginning of World War I for him to get deposed. To your point, though, I mean, you're right. We don't have a lot of internal signals about what's going on inside Russia. I don't know if you saw this. Putin and a bunch of Russian officials were visiting Kazakhstan, and the Kazakh president was about to address them. And none of them had the little translator headphones in because they just assumed that he was going to speak Russian. And he didn't. He just started laying it on them in Kazakh. And so you see all the Russian officials trying to fumble with the headphones, and they got to get it in, and they're all completely confused. So if you want an indicator about sort of the decline of Russian power, the Kazakh president is willing to sort of flex his muscle. I'll also say there was a ship in the Black Sea that was hit this week by the Russians. I think it was probably an accident because it wasn't a wheat or grain ship. It was a ship that was apparently transporting iron ore to China. And if you're Russia, the last thing you want to do is disrupt anything that has to do with China. I mean, that's that's the only thing that's sort of propping you up. So, I mean, we have all sorts of evidence of Russia declining sort of that stature. But I guess what I'm saying is I'm wondering if Russia can hold on and if Putin can hang on long enough for Ukraine to seal maybe its own demise. Whereas, I mean, even 3 months ago, I wasn't thinking that. So it's a pretty big shift in my opinion, although we'll see if I end there. I'm trying that idea on right now.
Well, we just don't know. That sounds really glib, but I think one of the hard things about what we do is we're not going to, we can't tell people that we know because we don't. And as investors, all you can do is sort of take those base rates and try to adjust them at the margin based on any new information that you have. But there's just so much uncertainty. We just don't know what the hell is going to happen. And all you can do is sort of try to put parameters around that when you're gauging risk. And I would love to be able to tell a story like, hey, this trend suggests that, in 3 months there's going to be a catalyst in the war. And this, we don't know. We have no idea. I certainly don't, and I don't think you do, and I don't think anyone does. So that's No, but I mean, just anecdotally, I think there were some U.S. investors who were looking at Ukraine as an opportunity. And if I was advising those investors, I would tell them things are looking a little bit more bleak right now. But as you said, we don't know, and things can change very quickly. Before I have to run to this breakfast, and I know that you have a call too, maybe just close. We usually start with markets. So why don't we just close with markets today and tell the listeners about credit quality and why that caught your eye this week in your sweep of what's going on? Well, I bring this up because we have had a number of sort of friends and podcast listeners contact us asking about the credit cycle in the U.S. and whether there's likely to be a lot of corporate distress as interest rates rise. And it's just worth pointing out that earnings season is winding down now, thank God. And one of the things that's really striking about the behavior of stocks coming out of earnings is, a lot of people who follow markets will know that a lot of the junk has rallied. A lot of the stuff that was very deeply oversold, the lower quality names, the growthy sort of stocks with high valuations, a lot of that has really rallied out of the hole. And some of that is short squeezes and, sort of technical factors. But one thing that's really striking is companies that appear to be having balance sheet issues, they're not rallying. And they had a brief little hiccup higher, in the last 2 weeks. But most of the ones that we follow that are really experiencing some debt-related stress, they're, back to the lows again. So that's a really interesting little data point, and I only mention it because when you're thinking about the direction of markets from here, That's going to be one of the growing issues as more and more companies refinance into higher rates. And a lot of the companies that had binged during the low interest rate years find that they can't refinance at all because they don't have the business, in place to support the debt structure that they've taken on. So that's a pretty negative thing for risk assets. If even on one of the most face-ripping rallies, if these companies can't get off the mat, it doesn't bode well, I will say.
Is there any fear about that it's sort of, I guess I'm asking, is there any systemic risk in that? Do you think that the problem is widespread enough that it could bleed out into other sectors that aren't as sort of risky, or is that a bridge too far?
Systemic risk is a difficult thing to define. I don't think so, because, when we've talked about financial crises or really, really disruptive credit events, ordinarily they're associated with things that are unknown, that came out of nowhere, that validated or invalidated some really critical assumption about how the system is working. So the example that we always give is in the subprime crisis, all of the AAA rated paper that people were buying was not AAA quality. And when that realization struck, that was the oh shit moment when things really became detached. I don't know if we have something like that in this environment. I think it's more of a slow strangling by the python kind of effect that's going to take place over time rather than some sudden shock, which is in some ways even worse, because a sudden shock, the Fed comes to the rescue and there's an urgency to deal with the problems and address them. And sometimes you have the bottom fall out in markets, but you moved pretty quickly to remediate the situation and people's expectations adjust. Whereas this looks more slow and ugly and something that's not going to be resolved quickly, at least if you look at some of these businesses, which, as we analyze some of these companies that have just been kind of bullshitting their way through the last 6 or 7 years and taking on too much debt and, adjusting their non-GAAP accounting. Now I'm getting too wonky here, but basically the numbers that they report to investors, which don't reflect the actual numbers of the business, they call that non-GAAP numbers. A lot of them are having to fess up here because in the end, cash talks, and suddenly cash matters in a way that maybe it didn't previously. So that's a big change.
All right, so the frog is boiling. Ukraine might be losing. We can't build nice things in the United States, but at least France has swimming pools and Brazil looks good. There's your too long didn't read. Rob, get to your meeting. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.